Hi teachers, in this video we're going to look at why and how we use formative assessments. Now this is something that we naturally do is formally assess during in-person instruction, but as we approach virtual learning in the fall, it's important for us to be even more intentional about how and when we check for our students' understanding. So to get us thinking about this, let's check out this graph and let's say that this bottom section here represents the 45-minute class period, okay? And with primacy kind of being the first 5 to 10 minutes and this last part, recency, being the last 5 to 10 minutes of our lesson. And what we see here is the percentage of words that students remembered from those points in our lesson. So what are some patterns that we notice and how should that influence our instruction? So what we see here is that students remember what happens at the beginning of class or their lesson with us and at the end, and their attention dips near the middle where a lot of times that's a huge bulk of our instruction. So this really speaks to the importance of formative assessment being a continuous tool to inform our instruction, not just something that happens kind of in the middle of our lesson, but especially at the beginning and the end. So we can formatively assess at 3 points. They can happen before our lesson as we assess students' prior knowledge. It can happen during our lesson as we check for understanding, and then certainly after so our students can reflect on their learning. So let's start with looking at how we might assess for prior knowledge. So sometimes it's easy to forget to do this component, and it's so important now as students have been outside of formal schooling for several months now. Is one reason to have prior knowledge assessment is to discover where our students' gaps are and where their misconceptions are so that we can address those in our lessons. We also have such a diverse student body that we want to honor their life experience and their culture and what students do bring to the table. We also know that brain research tells us that it's important that we build a bridge between what students already know, their prior knowledge, and the new learning so that it can stick in their brain. So here are some questions that we can use to assess students' prior knowledge. And they're very open-ended and not so much about asking multiple choice questions. So first of all, what do you think you know about this topic or concept? Where did you learn this information? Did you watch a movie on the Civil War or read a book in your ELA class, for example? And that way we can make those connections throughout our teaching. And then what questions do you still have about this topic or concept? So now we're going to talk about some ways that we can assess students' prior knowledge, and I'll give you some technology tools that you can use during your virtual instruction or even in person using that technology. So we could have students draw either a concept map, like a bubble map, or we can just have students draw out. So draw, for me, what you know about adaptation and modification, for example. We could have an online discussion with the benefit being that all student voices can be heard, where sometimes in in-class instruction, there might be only a few students speaking up. We could give students an image like the one you see here on Manifest Destiny and just having them brainstorm, what do you know or what do you see in this image? We could give them a 3 things word association, so giving them a topic like revolution, and then what are the 3 words that come to your mind? And using a tool like Mentimeter Word Cloud gives a really neat representation of what our students know. We could do a 90-second brain dump in which we just have students write down everything that they know about a topic. Google Forms is one way we can collect that data. So next we look at how we can check for understanding during our lesson, during the bulk of that instruction. So some questions that we can use to check for understanding are just simple, what is the answer to this? Whatever content or factual statements that we want students to know. What is this similar to and what connections can you make? So getting students to, again, build those bridges. And then what do you think about? So asking students to form some opinions about what they've learned. We know teenagers love to form opinions. And then how would you explain this concept to another student? So kind of letting the student be the teacher and therefore reinforcing the learning. And then what are the errors in? So giving students maybe an example, whether it be a writing piece or maybe a falsified news headline that we've constructed, and getting kids to catch the errors and then correct those errors. So some ways that we can check for understanding is using a really informal quick poll, using some of the tools suggested. We could also do a quiz, kind of like the Edpuzzle video you're watching, or a Google form to collect more specific data. We could do a review game to add some competition using Kahoot or Quizzes, which are free online platforms. And then you can have students do a short written response, giving them sentence starters to support their writing. You might want to get students away from the computer screen, having them somehow do their work on paper and then turning it in through a photo. Padlet's a great way to do that so that you can see all of your student work for a class period. You could have students do a video or audio response. This is a great way, especially for our English language learners or special needs students, to demonstrate what they've learned. And you could simply observe a group discussion, whether that be an in-class discussion or an online discussion, but really using what students say to respond and adjust our instruction. So the last way that we can formatively assess is after the instruction, to have students reflect on their learning. Such an important piece that sometimes it's easy to forget, right, when we run out of time and we might not be able to get to this piece. It's so important to be intentional. First, looking at asking students, what concept or skill did you learn today, right? Can they even articulate what did you learn today? And if you were going to teach this to someone else, how would you teach it? What would you say? Where would you start? And then we could also ask, what concepts or skills do you need to spend more time discussing or working on? So really working on that metacognitive skill for students to think about their own thinking, their own learning. So some strategies we can use for reflection are having sketch notes. So kind of like what we talked about with before, or assessing prior knowledge, just having kids write out, draw out what it is they learned. We can use an exit ticket similar to this one, which could be adapted to Google Forms and really used with any content you're teaching. We could have students share a high and a low, meaning the high, what is one thing that you're doing really well on, and one thing that's a low that you're still struggling with and need help. That could be a question that we pose to them, perhaps after they see some data from a formative assessment, like a quiz that we give to them. So you guys saw 3 different ways that we can formatively assess throughout our instruction. And when you come back to the whole group, you're going to do an activity with that information.